Hello, my love. We meet again.
Yes, I'm super excited for today. We're going to talk about the High Priestess card, which is one of my favorite cards in the whole tarot.
So, to start with, let's revisit the tableau just to look at where we came from. So, in the first episode, starting with card 0, the very first card we did is the Fool, going in order. And the Fool is, if you recall, a non-gendered being, right? So the Fool is the archetypal realm. It is preceding all things. It's a zero. There is no specific thing in consciousness yet or in creation. There is just consciousness. There is just the self, poised here on the edge of the cliff, ready to take this leap and descend into manifestation, to use one particular word. Lots of ways to contextualize that, but I think that's one that works for most people.
Mhm.
So we had the non-gendered being the Fool before any differentiation of anything, before any experience, before any emotion. There are no ups and downs. There is no me or you. There is just awareness, infinite, unified awareness. So we go from that non-gendered being to the first card, the first number, number 1. Okay, the first principle in creation is what we would call the masculine principle. That's why the magician is a man. And that masculine principle can be summarized as self-consciousness, self-awareness, a sense of I that didn't exist in the archetypal realm of the Fool because there is nothing to differentiate in that realm. And so we have the magician, which is where differentiation begins, where ego structure begins, the human personality, this so-called house. Remember the Hebrew letter bet means
Mhm.
house. The house of God, or the house of spirit, or the house of consciousness, in which the Fool comes to dwell in a way that generates a sense of separateness, or the potential for separateness, an I over here and a you over there, right?
Mhm.
So that was the masculine principle. And so we went neutered or non-gendered, masculine principle, and then here in card number 2, the High Priestess, we finally come to the feminine principle.
Mhm.
So if the Fool, if the Fool is simply pure consciousness, the magician is self-consciousness, so our egoic sense of separate self, then the High Priestess is subconsciousness. So
Mhm.
that aspect of consciousness, which is separate or seems to be separate, so we would use the term the personal unconscious or personal subconscious to refer to that separateness, although there is also a collective unconscious or subconscious as well. So she represents that aspect of consciousness in creation that is below the level of our regular daily awareness. Okay, so you can just look at the color comparison right away. All of the yellow is the color of light, the sun, and associated with air and the mind,
Mental activity.
mental activity, right? So all of this is like cerebral cortex. It's awareness, it's conscious
Mhm.
awareness. It's in the light, we would say. She is in the dark. So she's in a
Mhm.
dark temple, actually, which we'll go into. And the color is blue. It's the color of water. It's associated, as opposed to the magician, which is associated with the sun and light. She is associated with the moon and that kind of darkness.
Mhm.
Um, so
There's a little bit of yellow in the corner.
There is a little bit of yellow in the corner. You're jumping ahead. Yes, but why not? So there is no ahead. There's just what's here.
Here and
So
now.
yes, very good observation. There's a little yellow down in the very bottom corner here. We'll zoom in a little bit. And what that's showing in its placement is essential, because it's the floor, it's the ground. And this is pointing to the sort of cosmic reality and truth that consciousness is the ground of everything. Everything that is rests in or on consciousness. We would really say in. That even though we're talking about her as something separate, as subconsciousness, as that which is below the level of awareness, that really there's no such thing. That whatever it is that we're talking about here, it's all resting on the same yellow as the magician, which is the color of consciousness, conscious awareness activity, right? So that's what that represents.
I want to just say one thing that's interesting. It's just occurring to me now. Do you want to pull up the High Priestess card alone?
I was going to ask if there's anything else on the tableau that we want to mention.
No, but it would be cool to see the bigger card, because I have something that's maybe parallel that I want to share.
Okay.
That's
So
interesting.
let's pull up the High Priestess now and look at her.
Okay. So in Hinduism, there's a myth about the feminine, and maybe it's parallel, and I've literally never made this connection before. So in Hinduism, all of the mythology talks about the gods and the demons, which are masculine, and they're always equal to one another. They're like evenly matched, basically. And the demons in Hinduism are not actual figures, but they represent human mistakes like jealousy or greed. And so the gods and demons are always in battle. And then when things seem to be going bad for the gods, that's when they ask for the help of the goddess, the feminine. And so one form of the feminine that comes to battle the demons is called Kali. And she is dark. She has a lot of similar symbolism in this card. She has blue skin. She's much more fierce than this figure. She has a very grotesque looking face, a big long tongue. And so what happens with her is that she is not contained by herself. She's limitless in her ability to do battle and to contain the demons or destroy them, essentially. She is only contained by her consort, who is Shiva. And the only way that Shiva can contain her is to lay down at her feet. Literally, he has to fall at her feet. She stands on him, and then she comes out of her destruction phase.
Interesting.
Is there similar? Do you think that's similar to any of the symbology in here?
I mean, the easy answer is yes. I mean, pick your tradition and pick your symbols. It's always all pointing towards the same universal truth. So, of course, there's going to be similarities and tons of agreement. Coincidence, we should say, and I don't mean coincidence in a sort of derogatory way. I mean, literally, it coincides with, right? So yes, I do think there's something there. It's interesting. We'll get to it, but you can see in the card here that she has the moon underfoot, which isn't quite the same because the moon is feminine, but there is something in this card about her rulership and dominion over, in this case, it's more of like the principles of rhythm, for example, like the phases. What's that?
Cycles.
Yeah.
Fascinating.
Like Kali, for example, cycles of destruction, and peace, or building and destroying, or life and death, right? In fact, this card is a double letter, the Hebrew letter Gimel, and its double meaning is peace and strife, interestingly enough. And that's what you're describing, right? The rhythm of peace and strife, and their what they represent as opposites, essentially. We'll get into the conversation about opposites here in more detail. But the other thing is, I mean, that obviously jumps out at me is that masculine principle, along with the moon, the yellow in this card, is underfoot. Right? She is resting on that. It is the ground of her being. Right? It's sort of like when we talked about the fool and said that everything that comes after the fool is all held within the fool. It's just the fool in disguise. There really is nothing but the fool. All there is to the magician is the fool in a particular function. All there is to the high priestess is the fool in a particular function. So the fool is the ground of everything else that follows. And just another way of putting that is that consciousness is the ground of everything else that follows, including us talking about consciousness in a different form called subconsciousness, right?
Cool.
But we could say that the only reason that subconsciousness exists, so to speak, is because of the contraction of consciousness that took place, moving from the fool, stepping off the ledge, and into the house of the magician, right? So we think about consciousness as being sort of infinite and unlimited and complete total awareness. And then there's some contraction of consciousness to create the illusion of a separate something. Well, the creation of that separate something, or that specific limitation of consciousness, the natural byproduct of that is that there's going to become that which we are not aware of, or that which is subconscious, that which is below or out of the realm of our awareness. I do like the language "out of the realm of our awareness," because saying below repeatedly over and over and talking about the feminine principle, if people aren't understanding that, or if it's communicated or conveyed in the wrong way, then it creates sort of a hierarchical kind of dimension, which isn't accurate. It's why I like the Jungian term unconscious. There is a reason to use subconscious instead of unconscious. They don't quite mean exactly the same thing, but I will often use them interchangeably, because I don't like conveying below when referring to this aspect of consciousness. Yeah.
I think of it as beneath, but not like, more like a circle going in rather than like Earth going down. Well, I guess the Earth is a sphere.
It is.
Yeah.
As far as I know.
It's underneath, but not hierarchically so.
Well, to assign underneath as less than is totally arbitrary, right? Like what are we looking at here in the card? Underneath, talking about that yellow color, the principle of consciousness, it's that which holds everything else up, right? Like the foundation of the house is not the least important part of the house.
Sure.
It's the most important part of the house. It's the part of the house that if it's not built well, then the rest of the house can't come to be, or can't withstand, any wind or rain or movement of the earth or anything like that, right? So it's just as accurate to think about it as the most important part. Right.
I noticed, looking back at the tableau, that almost all of the cards have yellow in them. Not all of them, though.
Let me pull that back up.
I did not see it in the Deceiver card. Unless maybe it's in the gold above his head or something. Oh no, it's not gold. I guess gold hair.
Well, there's the little bit of the yellow of their hair. But yeah, the Deceiver and the Tower are cards of sort of total darkness, essentially. Most of the other cards are going to have yellow in them. Yeah.
Well, even the Tower card has the yellow sun and the crown.
Sure. It's the influence of the light moving into the realm of darkness. Yeah.
I think that's cool to see. Even in the nighttime, even in the High Priestess, which is the unconscious, there is the stability of the Fool, the predictability, I guess, of the Fool.
Yeah, the dependability, the reality that's really all that there is to everything that follows. Yeah. Okay. So let's look at her again. And I'm just going to mention some of the central themes here. And then we'll decide what we want to talk about. So I already mentioned that the Hebrew letter associated with this card is Gimel, which translates to camel. So remember, Hebrew, every letter is actually a word or a meaning, has a meaning associated. So the Hebrew letter Gimel means camel. And there is, we have to sort of move into the ancient mindset here and understand what a camel was. It was a means of transportation, primarily. In particular, great for crossing the desert, crossing vast areas of seeming lifelessness, right? And as such, the camel was a function of connection. It was a connector, right? That it was how trade took place between two cities across a desert. Was how communication took place. So to the extent that two cities had a relationship with one another, that mechanism which allowed for a connection to be there was the camel, that allowed for people to get from place to place. So that'll be an important theme here. I mentioned that it's a double letter, peace and strife, and in fact, this card represents all opposites. So the theme of opposites, or polarity, positive and negative, masculine and feminine, up and down, inside and outside. Every pair of opposite is really represented here. And if we think about this in terms of sort of a story of creation, we could say that they begin here. This is where opposites begin. Okay. So opposites, electromagnetism. She also represents intuition and deductive reasoning, cosmic memory, receptivity. And flowing from her gown, or it's more accurate to say flowing as her gown becomes an actual stream that is the literal stream of consciousness that is sort of moving through creation. And that stream also, sort of like the yellow, that stream shows up in many other cards. Flows all the way through the tableau, and the final place that it shows up is in the second to last card, Judgment. Okay. If we put on a religious or spiritual lens, we would look at the High Priestess as representing the goddess, the mother goddess. You already referenced that with the Hindu stories. And just as a tangent to come back to that, Kali and her sort of depiction as being ugly and scary and violent, that would be sort of a sub aspect of the High Priestess, not an exact one-to-one. That would be sort of a particular function and expression of the feminine principle that it serves. We'll come back to that. And so we would not just think about her as the goddess, but specifically the virgin goddess. And any virgin goddess in any culture is really going to represent the same thing. So some examples would be Diana or Artemis, Isis, Eve, although Eve isn't thought of as a goddess per se. She's, mythologically thought of as the mother of all mankind. So close enough to close enough to goddess status for this work. And then also the Virgin Mary. And similarly, in Christianity, she is not afforded goddess status, whereas Jesus is afforded God status. There's some quote unquote valid reasons for that, but mostly it's the fact that Mary isn't held in as high esteem as Jesus and isn't considered as much goddess as he is God is due to patriarchal misinterpretation, hierarchy, etc. While there are some technically good reasons for that it's a much longer conversation, there's just as many, if not more, good reasons to think of her as goddess. Right? But that's a big no-no in Christianity, specifically in Catholicism. It is what it is. I'm not in charge. Let's see what else. If we think about, so one lens is to think of her as goddess, virgin goddess. Another lens, if we think more in terms of alchemy, is to think of her and this card as representing Prima Materia, which means the first matter. So I mentioned earlier that the stream of consciousness begins with her. It begins there. She is that stream of consciousness, essentially, right? And it begins to flow here in this card and flows throughout the tableau. And we would just say that the beginning of that stream of consciousness is the Prima Materia. It's this is the first place that matter, creation, begins to show up.
I'm thinking back to our analogy with pregnancy. Would this card be like the presence of sperm and egg?
Yeah, I think specifically. So since you keep asking great questions, we'll just keep diving into great tangents. So if you look at the backdrop of this card, there's a veil there draped between the two pillars. And on that veil are palm trees or palms, right? The green palms and the red pomegranates. And those symbolically represent the male and female genitalia.
Oh.
So masculine and feminine principle, i.e. sperm and egg. So yes, it's right there, kind of central to the theme of this card.
Okay. But with sperm and egg, nothing has been decided yet.
That's right. It's not actually new life yet. This is in the same way that the Prima Materia is not actually matter. It's, even though it's called
Building
the
blocks.
first matter, it's what we would think of as sort of uncreated matter. It's like the quantum realm, essentially, where there's the potential for matter, but it all exists in a state of chaos and nothing has been differentiated yet. And just like in quantum physics, the first two cards of Tarot point to the exact same principle. So in quantum physics, we say that within the quantum realm, this is very, very rough science. Don't hold me to this. that within the quantum realm is all potential. The potential for everything is there, but it's not differentiated. Okay. So nothing has actually come into manifestation yet. And in quantum physics, what is known is that the thing that brings the potential of the quantum realm into manifestation is observation, i.e., consciousness.
Mm.
And the same thing is depicted here in the first two cards of the tarot, which is the magician, conscious attention, being projected towards or into or through the high priestess.
Mm.
It's those two things working together that leads to manifestation, leads to creation. Right? Just like in quantum physics, there's the realm. Technically, quantum physics says that until we actually observe something, it essentially isn't there yet.
Mm.
And it's only when we turn to observe or make a measurement of the thing that it solidifies into manifestation.
Mm.
Right? So quantum physics is pointing towards this relationship between conscious awareness and observation and the realm of the unknown.
Mm.
Or
so the magician and the high priestess.
Exactly, or consciousness and subconsciousness.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
So where should we start with some of these themes?
Well, it seems like the obvious place is to start with her. She's the central, if she's in the middle.
She is in the middle. So she's in the middle. She's seated on a gray cube, which is difficult to see, but it's there. The cube is a symbol of form. Okay, so again, it's pointing towards this card being the beginning of form, of creation, of manifestation. And it's gray because gray is the blending of black and white.
Mm.
So even though this is the card of opposites, and we see that in the pillars here. So we have the black pillar and the white pillar, which aren't just black and white, but again, positive and negative, masculine and feminine, literally every pair of opposites they represent. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
These pillars and their representation of opposites is the foundation of creation. So without opposites, we can't have a stream of consciousness, because a stream flows from point A to point B, i.e., there's movement. You can't have movement without opposites, without an up and down, a left and right, or here and there.
Mm.
Right? So the principle of having a here and a there is what allows for consciousness to move, to flow. In the Fool, there's just consciousness. It's not, nothing's happening. Nothing, it's not going anywhere. It's not doing anything, so to speak. There's no real movement. Remember, the Fool is perched on that edge forever, essentially. Right? So without opposites, we can't have movement, we can't have creation. The building blocks of matter in the realm of Earth are atoms, and atoms are combinations of protons and electrons, or positively charged masculine particles and negatively charged feminine particles. And it's the relationship between the protons and the electrons and the way that they hold tension with one another, in the same way that this veil is held up in tension between the two pillars, right? It's the tension between the protons and electrons and the different numbers of protons and electrons that create different elements. And all of that is what our entire universe is constructed out of. Yes, you can technically dig deeper and find quarks and gluons and things like that, but the point still stands. So back to her. So she represents all pairs of opposites, but she herself is poised in the center of all of those opposites, seated on a gray cube, which points to her what?
The combination of all opposites.
Yeah.
The gray.
Yeah, that's right. It points to her having reconciled all of the opposites within herself.
Mm.
And is seated in that place. And gray is the color of wisdom in many different symbolic traditions, but particularly in Tarot. So her place is a place of wisdom, seated on the combination or the unification of opposites. But the opposites still exist,
Mm-hmm.
right? If you don't have black and white, you actually can't have gray either.
Right.
gray is the product of black and white. Okay.
Mm.
So there's a huge clue there for us in terms of how to be in the world. If we look at this psychologically, right? So it's very easy to look out into the world and see debates, disagreements, stress, tension, etc., between two sides of different opinion,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or maybe it's not even opinion, it's just sort of possibility. There's this possibility over here and this possibility over there. And these two possibilities seem not to work together. They're opposites, right?
Mm-hmm.
They don't seem to jive. And yet this card is showing us that being wise, exercising wisdom, means maintaining the posture of this card, which is allowing for both extremes to exist, both opposites, both polarities to exist, but not choosing one pole or the other.
Mm.
And this is an important nuance here. She doesn't do that by knocking down both pillars and saying this pole is wrong or that pole is wrong, or polarity in general is bad, so I'm going to knock these pillars down. If she does that, the temple crumbles on top of her, right?
Mm-hmm.
And creation ceases to be. So that doesn't work. We have to allow the opposites to be there. We have to allow the different opinions, the different potentials, etc., to be the ground or the structure that holds up creation, but we don't have to fall for one or the other.
Mm-hmm.
And so sitting on the gray cube in our inner psychic space means not picking sides, actually. It means well, let's pick something topical. Why not? Politics, vaccines, masks. There are these
Just
two
Democrat and a Republican.
Yeah, there's these two very, very sort of well-defined camps. And the constituents of each camp are certain that their attitude is the right attitude, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's a pretty even split. I mean, our elections in this country, the last handful of cycles are like coming down to, very, very tiny margins. So it would be, I think, silly to say that one of these groups is right and the other is wrong. Half the country isn't insane, whichever half you disagree with or not, right? Mm. And if you look at this picture, again, the two opposites, black and white, they're both right in the sense that they both are a part of what holds up the structure. Mm. There's truth in each pillar, right? Mm-hmm. But again, looking at the High Priestess, she doesn't favor one pillar or the other. She allows both of these truths, even when contradictory, to exist simultaneously, and she sits in the middle of that tension. not picking one side or the other, but allowing the truth of each side to be present.
Mm-hmm.
And if we do that long enough, then something happens. Carl Jung refers to it as the transcendent function. Jungian psychology, I don't think he's the first to use that term. The idea is that when we hold two opposites and give them both permission to be present and create tension within us, that if we do that long enough, and there's this charge that's created, and then there's this spontaneous thing that happens, and there's the transcendent third principle, so it makes like a triangle, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a transcendent principle that would be the gray cube,
Mm-hmm.
where the tension of black and white finally sort of just spontaneously create some third thing, which is gray, which is wisdom.
There's so much, maybe we get into this later, but there's so much nuance to this as far as like practicality in life. Like the end advice, I guess we might as well talk about it now. There's a time for looking and holding the tension of opposites. I like to think of this card as like a sacred pause. Like when I think about my own High Priestess function, I think about it as a pause, like a moment to be with and sit with and observe. There's not a lot of action. There's no action happening. Like when I think about this card, there's flowing water, but she's not moving. She's not doing something. She's meditative or contemplative or something.
Yeah. Yes. Agreed. It's the beginning. It's the beginning of movement. It's the potential for movement, but it's not quite movement yet.
Right. So a misconstrued takeaway from what you've just said is that when I'm in the world, I should always be impartial in my actions or non-actions, I guess. Which is not really the whole teaching. Like this High Priestess function is about being capable of seeing the equality of the duality, and the oneness, and uniting them. But it doesn't mean that you can't make choices in your life. You can't choose one pillar or the other. You can't decide you're a Democrat or a Republican. And
it means, yes, thank you. It doesn't mean that you can't take action. It doesn't mean that you can't rest. It means that you don't, in your psyche, conclude that action is all there is and rest is bad and should be destroyed, or that rest is all there is and action should be annihilated. It means we give permission for the opposites to exist, and we can take action without choosing sides. So again, I think it's perfectly fine to make this topical. The vaccine debate, which is sort of coming back up because there's all sorts of new research data now about, well, the vaccines weren't quite doing what maybe everybody promised they were doing or said they were going to do, etc. Again, the country's pretty 50, most of the world, really. There's a very sort of 50-50 split over the people who are pro-vaccination and believe that it's a great thing and that it's the responsible thing, etc., and people who are in the opposite camp and think that it's not good for our health, that it was rushed, or that it's a government conspiracy, or whatever, right? And so in my personal experience here, I ended up being vaccinated because, I won't go into the whole story, because it felt like the right thing to do for me. But I do not condemn those who didn't choose to get vaccinated. And in fact, I could just as easily go stand over in that place and understand all of the truth of that pillar, just as I could go stand in the place of the other pillar and understand everything over there in terms of pro-vaccination. It means that we're able to see the truth in each partial worldview, but understand that it's not the complete picture. And so for me, even though I made a decision to go over to this pillar and get vaccinated, in my psyche, I'm actually still sitting on the cube, because I'm not pretending that that's the right thing or that everyone should have done that.
Right.
That's well, kind of a personal example there.
I think I agree with you. And what I'm pointing to is the fact that people will, it's common in spiritual groups and communities to want to adopt the attitude of the high priestess, not realizing. And so in their life, they are neutral on things. And maybe they don't act on things. And I was this way, like I'm not going to vote because I hate all of it. I think it's all bullshit. Right.
Yes.
So for years, I didn't vote, which is not really being neutral. It's just
Great.
not consciously choosing.
Yes. Thank you. So I'm gonna put that into sciencey terms.
Great.
Being neutral, neutrality is what you get when you combine the same amount of positive and the same amount of negative. But to even use the language neutral implies charge. It implies polarity, right? So it honors the existence of polarity, of opposites, of action, of movement back and forth between positive and negative, flow up and down, right? Neutral is what you get when you have the same number of protons as you have electrons, right? So a hydrogen, a molecule of hydrogen is H2. It's two hydrogens, and it exists in a neutral state, meaning there's the same number of protons in H2 as there are electrons. Okay. But there's still charge, right? Charge is still present. If you don't have charge, you don't have action, you don't have creation.
Yeah.
Right. So again, we don't get to knock the pillars down. This isn't an invitation to knock the pillars down and then just lie down on the floor. That's definitely not what she's doing, to your point. She's sitting in the place of tension.
Yeah.
And I don't know what your take on this would be, but my experience of this is that it is uncomfortable. And I think that that's an important piece of the puzzle here, because what you described, the caveat that you gave, what did you say again?
What tends to happen is people want to be neutral. They want to sit in the middle, and they don't want to make choices, because to make choices is to be of the world in a negative sense.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
To be
So
in conflict with something else.
Okay. So the caveat that you give here, to not take from this teaching, don't take this as an invitation to abdicate all personal authority and all personal decision making and all choice and just check out from the world, right? That's an easy thing to do. That's the easy way out, is to just say, nope, I'm not going to participate. I'm checking out. That's not being neutral. That is avoiding or trying to destroy all charge, positive and negative, saying, no, I'm not going to participate in electromagnetism. That's not what neutrality is. Neutrality isn't something that exists outside of the realm of electromagnetism. Neutrality is something that happens when you combine when the pillars are the same height.
Mm.
And you have balance. That's what neutrality is. It's balance. So yeah, thank you. I agree. It's not an invitation to check out of the world and not participate. And so again, as I was saying, for me, one of the clues is, does this feel easy? Like if it feels easy, then I'm probably checking out. If there's a difficulty, if being neutral feels difficult, then we're probably on the right track. If we look at the symbolism of this card, in the way that she's poised between the two pillars, and then look at her chest, which is the cross, it's an equilateral cross. The energy of this is very, very similar to the energy of the crucifixion, symbolically. And I think we can all understand that being crucified is not comfortable. That in the tradition of Christianity, the crucifixion is a symbol of suffering. Now, she's at peace here because she, quote, knows better, so to speak, to personify her. She knows better, and she is the master of this domain. So certainly she is at peace. But within the symbolism here, the being poised between two opposites, suspended from two opposites, that is literally what the crucifixion also symbolizes, is Jesus having willingly gone through this process of being suspended between the opposites, the upright and the vertical and the horizontal, and being nailed to those opposites and not taking himself down. Right. So in the Christian story, he's mocked, and the Roman legionnaires say, if you're so mighty and powerful, and you're really the Son of God, or you're really God, like everyone is saying, then just get yourself down off that cross. If he had done that, that would have been the thing you're warning against. That would have been checking out of the world. That would have been avoiding the difficulty of true neutrality in favor of just avoiding it all completely. So
Can I ask you? Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, can I ask you how you experience what this card represents in your everyday life?
That's a great question. I think what I would say is, so we've talked about some themes and identities here. We've talked about her as virgin goddess. You could also think of her as representing the soul. So in the same way that we have self-consciousness and subconsciousness, or our egoic daily awareness of the human personality, and that which lies below the level of that egoic awareness, right? I think we could say something very similar about the common usage of the word soul, and the fact that is something that is we perceive as mostly hidden from us, unless we've done a ton of spiritual work, essentially. That for most people, they think of themselves as I, and they say, I have a soul. Right? This is the language people use. And so there's a me and there's my soul, right? Implying that they're two different things. Okay. And fine, let's just go with that. Let's to the extent that they're two different things, I am the magician and my soul is the high priestess. So my daily egoic self-awareness would be my self-consciousness, my human personality. And then there's this thing hidden in the dark within me that I know is there, I trust is there, but is sort of ephemeral and difficult to put my finger on. And it can't be known as cleanly as I can know my conscious daily self.
Mm.
In this, and again, in the same way that people talk about going through a process of soul excavation, like literally digging out, uncovering their soul, or letting their soul express. I don't really think in these terms, to be clear, but I think it conveys symbolically an answer to your question, which is, what do I think of this card, or how does it resonate with me in terms of my daily life? What I can say, regardless of the language used, is that I know that most of what I am is below the level of my daily awareness.
Mm-hmm.
And she represents that.
Mm.
She is this, well, it works well because I'm a man. She would be my anima. She's the face of my unconscious self. But at the same time, she would also be that for all of humanity, of course.
Mm-hmm.
The collective. She's the collective unconscious, when viewed through that lens. She's my personal anima, or my soul, that aspect of myself which is unknown, that shows up in dreams, for example, and communicates through the symbolism of dreams. So this other half of my being that I can't really know directly in the same way that I can know my conscious egoic self.
Mm-hmm.
Does that
How
answer your question?
yeah, it does. It does. I thought it'd be useful to, illustrate how we experience the energy of this card, like practically.
Yeah.
I know for me, she's a very important card because historically I've been a very cerebral person from a great portion of my life. And so one of my jobs when I started therapy and started to become more me,
Mhm.
it was to begin to explore her
Mhm.
and to understand the feminine inside of me, what was beyond the surface or beneath the surface, whatever directional word you want to use,
Mhm.
that I couldn't touch. And so, for years I played with this, and I continue to do it every day. I work with the High Priestess card, not in, always thinking I'm working with the High Priestess card, but it's part of my daily life now
Mhm.
to work with this. And so in the beginning, my first experiences of that were with your mother when I began to do therapy with her. And she helped me to begin to, it's like you're on a little boat in the middle of the water and you're just beginning to start to like paddle through the water and look beneath the surface and see the fish. Now, what
Yeah.
is in here? So doing cellular release therapy was part of my like very first journey into knowing the subconscious and beginning to become aware of what's what's possible in my subconscious. What could there be in there? And then that evolved into playing with my dreams. And that evolved into intuitive writing, which I continue to do now. The High Priestess is what gives me the words when I'm writing the poems that I write. It's not me talking, it's her.
Right. And so just to connect, that would be this intuitive aspect. Like she is the source of and is intuition.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So when you say, when any of us say my intuition, that she's what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Right. In the sense that intuition is this intelligence and awareness that rises up out of the dark spontaneously, and we can't necessarily point to where it came from. right? And people say, well, why did you do that? I mean, that was perfect. How did you do that? How did you know to do that? It was just intuition.
Mm-hmm.
Something, some knowledge, some wisdom, right, seated on the gray cube, arose from the depths, and we acted on it. And yes, that's her function.
Yeah. So when I'm standing in the kitchen thinking, not even thinking, they have the intention of deciding like what sounds good to eat right now.
Mm.
I can logic it in my head, like, well, you've only had a banana today. You probably need X, Y, and Z additional nutrients, which is a good function. Like that's probably the Emperor card. I'm assuming it's a discriminatory intelligence. Or I can think intuitively. I can respond intuitively and see, where am I drawn? Like, what am I drawn towards? But that brings me to the next caveat that I want to talk to you about. You already know where I'm going.
Stealing my thunder. Damn
it. So within the waters of the subconscious, there is wisdom and folly.
Well,
right?
yes, that's interesting. Yes. Remember, so it's funny, you just picked those words out of intuitively thin air.
Mm.
I'm sure that you don't know that the double letter bet from the magician means wisdom and folly.
Oh, no, I did not know that.
Yes. So let's take exactly what you said word for word. There within the realm of the high priestess is wisdom and folly, right? Now she's peace and strife. I want to come back to that because those are essentially the two pillars. The black pillar is strife, the white pillar is peace. And that's important to come back to. But what you're pointing towards, and what I was getting ready to jump in with my own caveat, right?
Don't let yourself be only drawn to the chocolate, in other words.
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. That because of the influence of the magician and the fact that depending on our level of magicianship, our conscious participation with that, our expertise, we're creating either out of wisdom or folly. Remember, the high priestess represents feminine receptivity, perfect impressionability. That if the magician is acting in folly, then the high priestess, the realm of the high priestess, so to speak, is going to contain that folly, is going to take the impression from the magician, however misguided it may be, and say, well, if that's what you want, then that's what I'll give you. That's fine. Right? So this is very nuanced here. And this is going to launch us in several different directions. So let's try to keep track, by which I mean you keep track. Because I can't.
Okay.
She is the virgin goddess. Her undergarment is white. She is perfect. She is pure. She is untainted, so to speak. There's a whole bunch of ladenness there. We'll come back around to that. But what I'm trying to impress here is that perfection and purity and innocence, so to speak, is always, always, always true of her, no matter what. Having said that, the nature of how she works, of the nature of the subconscious, let's depersonalize it or demystify it a little bit here. The nature of the subconscious is that it will take anything that it's given and produce results accordingly. Okay. That is deductive reasoning. It's saying you give me A, I add it to B, we get C. That's how this works. In the same way that a garden, you can have like the most perfectly nutritive, flawless soil imaginable. And the soil itself always remains perfect. But if you drop weeds into that soil, you're going to get weeds. It doesn't mean that everything that grows out of the soil is perfect.
Sure.
Right? So that's the nuance here. And so depending on our level of magicianship, depending on the impressions that we've been given, how we grew up, the trauma we've experienced, how we think about ourselves, any like hundreds of thousands of if not millions of data points. All of that then lives in the garden of receptivity here with the High Priestess, that is a part of what comes out of the intuitive function. Meaning that this is not an invitation, just like it's not an invitation to check out of the world, it's also not an invitation to do whatever you want whenever you want to, because it's intuitive.
Mm-hmm.
That is a recipe for disaster.
It is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If I ate intuitively, I'd weigh 400 pounds.
I probably weigh much less.
Well, you and I have different gardens. Nonetheless, like the point stands, right? That's the caveat here, is that she's perfect, but our relationship to her has not been perfect. And there's a lot of relationship repair. Again, I'm speaking allegorically and symbolically here, but I'm not opposed to people kind of taking that literally, actually. I have certainly gone through phases in my life where, and I've talked about it, where I absolutely honored the fact that there was a female living inside me, and I had to talk to her, listen to her, etc. Like treat her like she is a part of me and a thing. That there's a relationship there that needs to be repaired, and worked with and honored and cultivated, to use a gardening term, before we create an environment where those intuitive hits become more and more consistently dependable and positively productive, in the sense that they create what we're consciously desiring, and not just what we're unconsciously manifesting.
And that's the function of the magician.
It's the function of the first four cards. So when we get through the Emperor, we'll talk about the cards 1 through 4. It's not the first 4. Cards 1 through 4 create this cycle that we'll come and talk about after the Emperor card, that in spiritual terminology is referred to as the law of prayer. But there's less sort of religious and spiritual ways of thinking about it, but it's essentially pointing to the fact that there's this feedback loop between magician, high priestess, empress, and emperor, and then the emperor comes back to the magician position, and this feedback loop is how we work with this relationship with the high priestess and or the empress, our unconscious self. In order to cultivate a more positively productive intuitive faculty. Yeah.
I wanted to say something. So the other day I was listening to a podcast on hypnosis. And it was a really interesting podcast. And I'll link it in the comments in case anyone's interested in hearing about it. But the interviewer was asking the hypnotherapist about what it is that makes hypnosis work. Like, how does it actually work? And what the hypnotherapist explained was that you're entering into the client's world. You're partnering with their subconscious mind, and you're following the cues of the subconscious mind. It's like a really interesting and respectful relationship that you have with the person's subconscious mind. And mindfully and carefully, you're asking questions of the subconscious mind, which what that does is it evokes neuroplasticity in the person. It evokes flexibility and receptivity, not to impose the clinician's will upon the person's subconscious mind, but to evoke from within the person's own evolution, I guess, or own inner changeability,
Yes.
responsiveness.
Love it.
Mm.
Yeah. So that takes us back to the thing I wanted to not forget about. What you just described is a more science, neurology, psychotherapy based way of saying virginity
Mm.
or perfection or innocence, which is to say that what you just described is honoring the fact that our mind and our psyche and our brain and our nervous system have this pliability such that they can always be returned to some more natural, less traumatized state.
Mm-hmm.
And the potential for that is never lost.
Mm.
Right? It's no matter what we've been through, somebody can engage in this process of hypnotherapy and with the guidance of a teacher and therapist, access the innate plasticity that is always there, in the same way that water is always plastic, in that it has that same sort of plasticity, in that no matter what you pour water into, it just takes the shape of that thing.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't like the shape that the water has taken, you just put it into something else that has the shape that you want. That the water is always capable of changing shape. It doesn't lose its flexibility.
Mm-hmm.
And that applies kind of molecular and chemically as well, in that you can add various, dirt or chemicals to water, and you go, oh my God, this water is tainted. Except you can then filter the water,
Mm-hmm.
or evaporate it and turn it into steam and collect it, and always access the purity of the water again.
Mm-hmm.
That no matter what you do to it, it's still at its essence the same thing. And
Mm.
and it's untaintable. It's untainted. No matter what you do to it, its essence can't really be contaminated. And so, yes, you're talking about hypnotherapy as a way of accessing that truth within our nervous system. And that's what this virgin goddess represents in her virginity.
And I would say, I have absolutely experienced that, like directly, in
Mm-hmm.
almost a mystifying way, like through the process of hypnotherapy, meditating, and honestly becoming more and more flexible. My mind has become incredibly flexible now, where if I discover that there's some belief that I'm holding that I don't really want to hold anymore, it just takes moments for that whole paradigm to shift inside my mind. Whereas before it would have taken months or years or whatever. Now it's just very quick turnaround. But I've had that direct experience in, therapy, of doing deep hypnotherapy and realizing how everything can be washed clean. And so when you think about things after you've done resolving them with therapy, they really just have like a translucence to them. They don't even really seem to have, like, can't even touch them the same
Mm-hmm.
way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So yeah, it's interesting.
Yes, and I think that now that flexibility that you're talking about, I would also reference back to sitting on the gray cube and not picking sides.
Mm.
That's where the flexibility comes from, right? And vice versa, the practice of being flexible helps to seat us on that gray cube and put us more and more in a place of wisdom. And so what it means to be flexible and what you just described is that in your psyche you can swing from one pillar to the other effortlessly.
Yeah.
And empathize truly, right? Not just have an intellectual experience of what's going on, but literally be over there feeling and living in this truth, and then with your flexibility swing to the other side and just as completely embody and empathize with the opposite truth as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm. You know, I don't find the experience of the High Priestess to be uncomfortable. I only find it uncomfortable if I'm living in one pillar or the other.
Well,
Personally.
yeah, I guess it depends on where we perceive the discomfort to come from. I think people living in one pillar or the other have a lot of difficulty in their life, and I agree that that's probably what you're pointing towards. I think that to live in either extreme and is to have lost our flexibility, and the whole world becomes scarier. I think so. This is another piece of what's being shown to us. She is the unknown. This is the realm of the unknown. It's the unconscious, that which is outside of our awareness. And if we're anchored in just one side, one pillar, then we become afraid of the other half, and we develop a fear of the unknown. And so I think that's the discomfort that most people live with, right? If they're rigidly pro-vaccine, then it's sort of a miserable experience to walk around in the world being afraid of everybody who's not vaccinated, right? And vice versa. If you're rigidly anti-vaccine, and you walk around in the world perceiving people to be trying to oppress you and the government trying to con you and all of that, then that's pretty miserable. I agree. There's a lot of suffering that comes from being polarized, being firmly in one pole or another. But my experience is that there is an egoic suffering that comes from being in the middle, from being neutral. That and maybe you just didn't, I don't know, maybe you didn't ever have any of this because your ego was always more pliable, flexible. But for most people, I feel comfortable saying, there will be an intense discomfort, an egoic discomfort, a sense of, but who am I if I'm not anchored in this belief over here? And it's not comfortable for people to begin basically looking inside themselves and going, okay, where's everything in me that I have ever found ugly that's being projected over on these other people that I have to now own? Like that, I think that's an uncomfortable process for people. And maybe it's just semantics, but I've seen you do a lot of that. A lot of ownership, you know.
Yeah.
To me, that's the High Priestess. It's being seated in the middle there on the gray cube, is looking at where we have been polarized to one side or the other, looking at the other side in that realm of the unknown, and recognizing that we have a strong distaste for it, and that it's actually something it's resonating with something that's a part of us, and having to admit that.
I think here's where I'm experiencing it different than you. If I'm really in this place of High Priestess, seeing through her eyes, or rather, if I'm caught in dualities or feeling uncomfortable tension, I am not in the High Priestess.
I agree. Yeah.
So like the High Priestess experience is not uncomfortable for me.
Okay, fair enough. Yes, again, I think
only if I'm in my like, you know.
I think it's semantics. Yes, I mean, it's right there. She's at peace.
She's chill.
So being in the place of the High Priestess, I will amend my language and statement. Being in the place of the High Priestess is not uncomfortable. Getting there,
that's uncomfortable.
is uncomfortable.
That is 100% true.
Yeah. Getting there. And so when people begin to work with this card and understand what it means and look within themselves, and I want to look at the pillars here for some more examples of this, but begin to understand where they're trying to hold up their temple with just one pillar, right? And if you really want to be at peace, i.e., not constantly worried that the roof is going to fall down on your head, then you need that other pillar over there supporting the structure, right?
Mm.
Well, the other pillar is everything you hate. And or everything that you've rejected or disagree with or whatever.
Or don't know anything about.
Yeah. And if you want the structure to be solid and you want to have the experience of being able to sit in peace on the cube in the middle, then you have to reinstall that other pillar. You have to embrace everything that is the opposite of what you've identified with. That's uncomfortable. So let's look at these pillars again, because I think there's a lot of practicality that can come out of this. So again, they're black and white. The black pillar is symbolic of learning through resistance. Okay. So it is the pillar of strength, essentially. Okay. Whereas
like learning through difficulty, efforting.
Efforting, action, discipline. The black pillar, to go with something near and dear to my heart, the black pillar is weightlifting. It's getting better, improving specifically through the act of moving against resistance and getting stronger as a product of that, right? Whereas the light pillar is more learning through grace.
What would that be like in your real life?
Sitting and meditating and having ahas. Or let's make it more practical. The black pillar is the attitude of, if I want something in my life, I have to show up and work hard for it. Okay. The white pillar is, I surrender to divine will and will allow the goodness that is my God-given right to be handed to me in due time. Both of these are true. If you pick one or the other, then you're missing half the equation. Do you disagree?
No, I'm just
You're making faces.
I am making faces. I cannot hide my artistic faces,
No, you can't.
unfortunately. Oh, I'm just noticing how I'm thinking about how this shows up in the world with people. You have these proponents, these like podcast bros that are like black pillar all the way, right?
Yes.
And then you have the woo-woo, like silly, I mean, it's equally ridiculous. People who are just like passively like waiting for magic to fall into their laps, essentially. And I'm sure it happens, like success is to be had in both areas to a degree. To some degree, right?
Well, I'm going to wait for you to finish your thought before I. Is that it?
Well, I mean, there's problems with both strategies if you don't embrace the other side. It's just ridiculous.
That's the point. Great. We're done. Yeah, that's exactly right. Yes. You can't hold up a roof with one pillar.
Right.
You need two. Yeah. Yeah. So again, this points to the whole tension or suffering or difficulty here of getting into her place in the middle, suspended between the two pillars, is having to figure out what the hell that looks like in our life. Well, what am I supposed to do? Am I supposed to act, or am I supposed to trust God? Yes. Right? Yeah, but does that mean I have to go work on these things, or should I pray and meditate more? Yes. well, is one better, and back and living in the tension of sort of constantly not knowing, well, which, at any given moment, should I sit down and meditate or pray, or should I get off my ass and go do something? Well, that's the suffering. That's, to the extent that there's suffering, that's it. That's where we have to work with this, and simply practice being with it, and recognize, really, for me, it's just a process of doing what's intuitive, and recognizing at some point if I suddenly find myself dominated by one pillar in my life.
Yeah.
Right. If I'm listening to my intuition, and then the next thing I know, all I'm doing is working my ass off. Right. At some point, I'm going to have a realization of that. That would be the emperor function, which we'll get to in a couple episodes. Right. But I'm going to have some recognition of that and go, oh, I'm out of balance. I need to choose to plug into the white pillar and become more receptive to grace and the movement, let's say the movement of the Holy Spirit through our lives. Just
how would you do that, practically speaking?
Practically speaking, it's just a switch that I can flip in my psyche. So I don't know how helpful that is. I guess that's not all that practical, is it?
Where'd you get that? Amazon? How much is it?
In fairness, I suppose that's from years of cultivating that, right? To me, it's very easy to recognize that my attitude has become far too doing and not enough being. And I go, oh, okay. And then I just bring my conscious attention back to the being side of the equation. And again, looking at the pillars, black is doing, white is being. And so which is right? Should we just be in the world, or should we do something? Yes. Right. So yes, a lot of there's this movement in masculinity these days that's portrayed as healthy masculinity, and certainly is relatively healthy, but isn't well balanced. That men should, just be doing all the time, even if it's not quite in the old way of like, well, you've got to be patriarchal and you've got to be the breadwinner and all of that, but just the idea of discipline, like the Jordan Peterson and the kind of branches of his kind of fellow thinkers. There's this really strong movement into men showing up and taking responsibility for their life, and that means taking action and doing. Well, that's not bad, right?
Sure.
But it's also not comprehensive. So that's the doing side in the black pillar, and then there's the being side in the white pillar. And again, for me, it's just recognizing when there's too much doing going on, too much thinking, and it shows up for me as a sense of when I know it's gotten out of hand, as if I suddenly feel like I am solely responsible for my life. And when I say I mean my ego self. When if I feel this intense sort of pressure, that I, egoic Noah, has to go and do this and this and this in order to guarantee this outcome, then I know I'm not seated on the gray cube. Now, that doesn't mean I stop doing that and just spend my day sitting and meditating and praying. It might mean I need to come into some more balance. But again, the idea here is that both of these things have to exist. It's about working with them in balance. And when we're ultimately in balance, it doesn't mean spending an equal amount of time in the black pillar and an equal amount of time in the white pillar. It means spending time in the black and white pillar simultaneously. And that looks like being seated on the great cube. In other words, I don't have to stop doing in order to come into balance. I can simply recognize that I'm in an abundance of ego energy, and that there's fear or anxiety operating, leading me to think ego Noah, has to go and make all of these things happen in the world. I can keep doing those things, but flip the switch and remember what's true. Reaccess the energy of the fool and the sense of my virginity, my innate perfection of being, and reaccess the trust in the universe and my knowing that the unknown is benevolent, and that all of these things that I can't see because they haven't unfolded yet, know that all of that is happening in divine planning, and that ultimately I'm fine. And I can reaccess all of that while still doing all of the same things.
Mm. Mm. It's not as easy for me to think practically about what these black pillar and these pillars, like how that's functioning in my life as it used to be. It's a little weirder for me now, but I think if I had to simplify it, like very basic language, I would say the white pillar is when I'm asking for help.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and then I've done that for years now. Like, I don't know what this is. Like, whoever is out there, and I don't really mean that literally. It's sort of a force of habit. Help me figure this out. So there's like this, the question is the white pillar, like the inner question. And the black pillar often seems to come after the white pillar linearly.
Mm-hmm.
Is okay, I'm going to try some things. Like I'm going to take I'm going to take action on a few items. I'm going to try these things. That's the best way that I can explain how I experience that practically.
Yeah, I love that.
Is there anything else about her? I have a poem about her that I found.
Great. Well, just to finish looking at the black and white pillars, and the resistance versus grace. So the letters on the pillars, on the black pillar is the letter bet. So that's the magician, right? Remember I was saying that if I'm too much in ego, that's for me a clue that I'm imbalanced towards the black pillar. Well, the letter associated with the black pillar is bet, which is the letter of the magician, which is that egoic self-consciousness and sense of conscious doing, right? And then the white pillar, the Hebrew letter there is Yod, which we haven't come to in the deck yet, but is associated with the hermit. And Yod is I, like the I am, essentially. Yod is the first letter of the name of God. So it's the I aspect, or the beingness. Anything else, the symbolism here? Well, important. There's moon associations, as I mentioned. So her crown is a full moon in the center, and then 2 crescent moons on each side. And that is pointing to the rhythmic or cyclical nature of creation. Mm-hmm. And also, if people go and look up, in fact, I'll just put up a picture of Isis, you'll see that that's a direct reference to the Egyptian goddess Isis as well. In this particular one, she doesn't have the moon underfoot. This is a different version. But there are versions where she has a half moon underfoot as well, which is just showing that she has mastery over, or dominion over, the cyclical nature of creation. Mm-hmm. And then in her lap, there's another reference to the cyclical nature of things, which is this rolled up scroll. So you can see it's got sort of a spiral shape. Again, there's a spiraling or cyclical nature, and written on the scroll is the word Torah, which is Hebrew for the law. Mm. So the first 5 books of the Bible are referred to as the Torah, the Hebrew Bible. And It just means the law. And I mentioned earlier that this is the beginning of the process of creation, which is then reviewed by the emperor, and then we go through that cycle again, that spiral. And I refer to that as the law of prayer. And it just means that this is not, it's law, it's non-negotiable. It comes back to the analogy of the really fertile garden, that whatever seeds we drop into the garden. So the magician is the one selecting and dropping the seeds. The high priestess is the one receiving them, right? Which is literally human biology. The man has the seed, the woman receives the seed, and then creates logically from there. That's a law. That whatever seeds are dropped, that's what's going to be created. And there's just, it's non-negotiable, right? You don't plant an apple seed and get a pine tree, right? That would violate the law, right? Two humans don't have sex and give birth to a kangaroo. Not how it works.
Right.
Yeah. So, okay. I think that I mentioned the equilateral cross on her chest, which is right over the heart, which again is showing that even if we're doing or being or choosing this or that in the moment in life, that our heart is a place of balance and neutrality. What else? Talked about the robe is the beginning of the flow of consciousness, the movement of creation. I think that's pretty much everything.
Okay. You want me to read my priestess poem that I wrote 2 years ago?
Please do. Yeah.
Okay. It's called The Priestess Within. In the space of nothingness and everythingness, she dwells, inviting us to plant within her fertility something beautiful. She is the water of the subconscious, and like fish in the lake of God, our fears, thoughts, and beliefs swim madly. She is also the moon, silently keeping watch, patiently redirecting us towards wholeness as we contemplate her on a starry night. We can see in her both dark and light and know the truth of our own being. We can follow her into everything. Through her, we go beyond the veil into the birth of love. It's meant to like bring you into the Empress card.
Love that. That's my favorite poem.
Well, till next time.
All your poems are my favorite poem.
Oh my love. I'm glad you love it.
Okay.
So next time we'll come back with the Empress.
Yes. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.